Good morning again. I'm back for a second week. I like that video that you do before I come up. It makes it feel all fancy. So today we're going to continue talking about the kingdom of heaven, and it's going to build directly on what we talked about last week when Jesus laid out for us this vision of the different ways in which the words of God are received. And remember, we talked about they're always received with joy, but there are things in the soil sometimes which prevent people from really being able to grab hold of that. And so the call then for you and for me is to be a part of that process of making those paths straight. One of the parts I love most about like the Advent season is John the Baptist, because we always get to read the passages about John the Baptist, and John the Baptist just shows up like this figure from a Western, just kind of like emerging out of the desert with this clarion call of, make smooth the paths because the Lord is coming, right? So this continues to be part of the call of the people of God, to come to be able to identify those things which are getting in the way of people being able to grab hold of this huge vision that Jesus is laying out for us with respect to what the kingdom of heaven looks like. So, it's a pretty great vision. Who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want a world in which people are forgiven? Who wouldn't want a world in which people's debts are repaid? Who wouldn't want a world in which judgment is rendered properly? Who wouldn't want a world in which returning violence for violence isn't the way that we do things anymore? Like, who wouldn't want that kind of world, right? If only it was easier for Christians going out and talking about this radical vision of Jesus, if only it was easier for us to be able to lay claim to that and to help it to actually take root, right? We have this call from Jesus. We are to be part of those who help clear out the thorns, who help the seed that is wanting to take root, to help it to take root. But it's not quite that easy. And today's parable kind of gets us into some of that. If last week was the good news, the call that you have been given by God to help be a part of that, right? To help the words of God to take root into the lives of people that they might join in this kingdom of heaven. The next parable, the one that we're going to be talking about today, is a little bit more sobering, but bear with me. The world in which Jesus describes around the kingdom of heaven is not a safe one. It's full of obstacles. It's full of enemies. It's not just the Romans or the powers of the principalities. Jesus goes to great length to kind of describe the ways in which there are any number of things which beset us. It would be easy if the things which Jesus described we could just do straightforward and there were nothing in the way, no obstacles. Again, who wouldn't want that? But that's not the world we have. This is not the way of the kingdom of heaven. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives instructions on how to forgive, how to be patient, that the rain will fall on the just and the unjust. And because of the nature of the kingdom of heaven, this is not something that's going to be celebrated. Because here's the thing, if you go around telling people that God wants to forgive the people that other people despise, like, there are going to be people upset with that. If you go around telling people that God forgives enemies, there are going to be people upset with that. If you go around telling people, like Jesus does in the sermon, that we shouldn't give preferential treatments to people with money or power, and that we shouldn't be worried about our money or our wealth, that will not go over well, right? It will find obstacles. Jesus' kingdom will have enemies. If for no other reason than it's witnessing to a world in which God is king and all of these other things which promise safety and security, wealth or power or a future, they're just idols. They're not gods. Jesus calls us to a different kind of kingdom. And when we start talking about that, it's not going to go well, as the parable today gets us into. During the Second World War, there was a German Christian thinker and writer and pastor, one that I love reading and learning from. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he worked in a time prior to the rise of the Nazis when he worked primarily with folks who were training for ministry. And over the course of about 10 years, for a variety of reasons, it became very difficult for him to do what he was doing. It was imagine you're going to church and you're doing your job, you're trying to be a witness for the kingdom of God, and everything is relatively normal. Everything is kind of easygoing. And then all of a sudden, everything within church just gets politicized because of all the politics that are happening outside of us. That was Bonhoeffer's experience. Surely we have no idea what that could possibly be like, right? So it's during this time that Bonhoeffer starts running this underground illegal seminary to help train ministers. And he writes this book called Life Together, which I highly recommend. You should all buy copies of it and read it. It'll take you 2 days. It's beautiful. But in it, one of the things that he writes is, the church always gathers, he says, in the midst of its enemies. That peacefulness, that easygoing, peaceful situations for churches are not the norm, or at least they shouldn't be the norm. Most frequently, both in history, in Bonhoeffer's own day, in in the way that Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, there's always going to be an obstacle to doing the things which Jesus talks about. It's not the norm that things would be easygoing and straightforward. So when Bonhoeffer writes this line that the church will always gather in the midst of enemies, he wasn't being theoretical about this. He was going to church council meetings on the national level where people were actively wanting to shut down what he was doing. He wrote this line reflecting his own experience of trying to do the work of the kingdom of heaven, knowing that most often the kingdom of heaven will have its enemies both within the church and outside of the church. Sometimes it's people that we go to church with. Sometimes it's our neighbors. Sometimes it's family members. Sometimes it's the coworker. That these enemies are kind of all around us. The enemy in this parable is presumably one who knew the owner of the field well enough to A, know that they know where the house was, B, know where they were planting, which fields belonged to this guy, and C, knew that he had planted these fields recently and that the harvest was to be expected, and had just some sort of he had some sort of grudge or some sort of animus against this guy. So that's where I wanted us to pick up with the second of the third parables that Jesus tells here in a row in Matthew 13 about the kingdom of heaven. So if last week we had the opportunity to talk about our ways of engaging with these obstacles, of helping to remove these obstacles, of being able to see what these obstacles are for people grabbing hold of the kingdom of heaven, in this parable, Jesus wants to just soberly remind us there are going to be obstacles to us doing that. It will not be straightforward, right? So, how should Christians respond when we find opposition? The first parable from last week began with the sower just tossing seeds left and right all over the place. And in the aftermath and the conclusion of that parable, the seeds just begin to grow up and the harvest begins to take off, right? So the parable of today opens up kind of as a sequel to that. The good seed that the sower had thrown into the seed is going crazy, right? The harvest, the wheat is growing 10, 20, 50-fold, as the parable before it tells us, and someone has come along in the night and filled that wonderful seed, that wonderful field, all full of weeds and left. And so the servants go to the sower again, and they say, okay, it worked. You have a lot of wheat growing here. Things are going great. One problem, you have a bunch of weeds growing in the field. What do you want us to do about this? And the farmer just says, don't do anything about them. Just let them grow. This to me sounds like a really kind of a very bizarre approach, but it begins to make sense as we begin to look at it. So the sower says, nope, just leave it all alone. when it's time, I'll reap the weeds first, and we'll take care of those, and then we'll take care of the wheat, and it'll all sort itself out in the end. And in the parable from last week, we saw how part of the issue here, with there even being weeds growing like crazy, is that it worked. God threw the seeds out, it found purchase in the soil, and things are happening. Good things are happening. There is a harvest happening. Every time, as we saw in the previous parable, that a seed is planted, something good happens. And so the sower here is honestly a victim of his own success. Some really petty enemy decided that this field was doing too well, that things were working a little bit too smoothly for this guy, and decides to come in and plant a bunch of weeds in his field. Now, why his enemy just had this reserve of seeds for weeds just hanging around, I don't know. You ever think about that with this parable? Like, this guy had to have this big sack of weed seeds. Why a person would need those, we're not told. It's kind of beside the point. The point is that the sower had done his job really well, and now someone has come along to oppose that. So as we start to unpack this parable, I want to make, one point should be made really early here so that we can hear this parable well. The weeds in this parable are not the thorns from the previous parable. The wheat in our parable for today appears to be in no real danger of dying. That's a really important point for us to grab onto. If it were in imminent danger, then I think the farmer would have taken a little bit more proactive approach. But though these weeds are really annoying and they are an obstacle, they're not an ultimate obstacle here. They're not the thorns that are going to choke out the seeds. They are just mixed in, and at best they're going to make it difficult for the servants to pick out the wheat when it comes time, but there's no real danger of the wheat being killed by the weeds. I repeat, the weeds are not going to kill the wheat. The gates of hell will not prevail. Death will not have the final word. Justice of God will not go deterred forever. The real threat, the parable tells us, is not from letting the weeds grow, but from trying to pull them out. This is a real worry. If you've ever grown anything in a backyard garden, as I've been doing for the last several years, you can get along with actually a good number of weeds in the garden. But if I try to go in and start plucking out all of the weeds just because they're obnoxious to me, then I run the very real risk of damaging the plant that I actually want to see grow. Because here's the thing, if we're growing vegetables or growing wheat of some sort, the root system of that has to remain fairly flexible. It's not going to drill down deep like an oak. It's not going to get rooted like a tree and dig a taproot a mile deep. It's not going to do that. It's going to remain fairly close to the surface because it's constantly seeking out nutrition, trying to remain sensitive to where the water is. The roots of my vegetables are going to remain flexible and pliant because if they don't, they will die. So, the upside to this is that these roots have to remain very vulnerable, and that vulnerability is what opens up the space then for these weeds to grow, right? I could have a vegetable that drilled down deep, and then I could go after the weeds wholeheartedly because I don't have to worry about them. But that's not really kind of how vegetables work, right? Vegetables have to remain flexible and movable, and because that's what they are, I've got to let the weeds grow up among them. Because by the time I see the weeds, the root systems of the weeds have already become entangled with the good stuff. By the time I see them, it's too late to do anything about them, because if the root systems are already like this, right? They are drawing from the same good soil that is helping the vegetables to flourish. So when Jesus tells this parable, like he's giving us a great bit, not just like agricultural wisdom, which it is, but like this very great paradigm here. Risk to the very good things of the kingdom of heaven cannot be avoided. There is no scenario in which we do things for the kingdom of God and there is no risk to it at all. There will always be weeds growing up, because if the soil is good and things are being produced, all kinds of things will be produced in that. The reason that these weeds are going bananas is because the soil is amazing soil. The same soil that allows the wheat to grow is doing wonders for all of the weeds as well. On a less agricultural level, this is a real challenge, though, to the people of God. We would rather it not be that way. We would rather it not, like with the psalmist, that the wicked prosper. The Psalms are full of complaints like this, like Psalm 13, where the psalmist writes, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long do I have to take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart? How long," he says, "shall my enemy be exalted over me?" Or in Psalm 94, "Oh, how long, O Lord, how long will the wicked be joyful? They just pour out arrogant words. The evildoers are full of boasting. They say, the Lord doesn't see, the God of Jacob doesn't take notice." This thing that Jesus is calling his people to, this is something that they knew very well. This conundrum of being faithful and doing the things of the kingdom of heaven, all the while the good things they are doing are providing the conditions in which the weeds are growing up. It's part of the deal. When we do good things, not everyone that we want to prosper from that will be the ones who prosper. As Jesus said, when God gives rain, he gives it to the just and the unjust alike, right? God is not a discriminatory God with that respect, that he forgives the ones that we don't want to be forgiven. He gives support and sustenance to those that we would rather not be supported and sustained, right? But here's the thing. This all sounds very frustrating to me, but unless the kingdom of heaven is growing up alongside the weeds, how could the weeds ever know about the goodness of the kingdom of heaven? If the kingdom of heaven is just growing off here and the weeds are over here, then all we're doing is just consigning the weeds to endless destruction. But there's an unintended consequence here. The weeds, when they're growing up mixed in with the kingdom of heaven, they give us an opportunity that maybe some of these weeds may not ultimately turn out to be weeds. I'm going to tell us a story real quick about this parable. Has a long and really fascinating history of interpretation. I'm not going to bore you with any of that. There was a guy named Roger Williams. If you're a Baptist, maybe you've heard the name Roger Williams, maybe not. He founded literally the First Baptist Church in North America. It's in Providence, Rhode Island. You can still go see it. It's still in operation in the 1600s. So Roger Williams came over in the 1600s as part of one of the Puritan colonies. He doesn't stay very long. He gets booted out and has to go and take up residence in Rhode Island to kind of, to find his way in the New World. So Roger Williams finds himself living in Rhode Island, and he finds himself living on the land of a Native American tribe called the Narragansetts, right? When he was in Massachusetts, Roger Williams did not think that the way that Plymouth was dealing with the Native Americans was very fair. He didn't think it was very just, and that's part of the reason he found himself booted out. That's a longer story. So when he gets to Rhode Island, he decides, we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm here as the guest of these people whose land I'm living on, so we've got to do things a little bit differently. And so over the span of 10 years, he develops all sorts of treaties with them. They start to engage in trade. They learn agriculture from one another. He begins to develop this robust relationship with them. So in 1644, Roger Williams writes this big, long treatise called The Bloody Tenants, which is his most famous work, and it's all about religious liberty. It's all about how Christians shouldn't be coerced into making confession of faith, but it should become something that comes up naturally. If you've been Baptist more than about a day, this all should sound very familiar to you because Roger Williams is kind of like the hero in the story. So 1644, he writes this big religious liberty treatise about how people's consciences should be respected, etc. The same year that he publishes that, though, he publishes this other work called A Key to Native America, in which he talks about the Narragansetts. He talks about the way that they eat. He talks about the way that they worship. He talks about the way that they dress. And he finds all these interesting parallels between the ways that he has done things and the ways that they have done things. That over time, one of the things that happened with Roger Williams in Rhode Island is that Narragansett churches began to grow and began to show up over that 10-year period. As Williams begins to kind of get to know his neighbors and recognize that they are literally living off of common ground, common soil, right? Williams never wants to do the thing where he thinks that they're all Christians already. He recognizes that there is a real difference between what he is doing and the way that the Narragansetts are living. But he also recognizes, and he writes about his version of the parable in here, that we share this common ground, and it's only by sharing that common ground well that maybe some of the folks that I thought were weeds might actually turn out to be wheat after all. And so by 1650, you have a flourishing church population among the Narragansetts. For Williams, one, he didn't view the weeds as a threat, but as those with whom the kingdom of heaven shares ground, while at the same time recognizing that there was real difference between them. Over the course of the years that Williams spends among them, he endeavors not just to tolerate the existence of the Narragansetts, but to understand them, to learn the ways in which they've lived, and to see the ways in which his life, the people he's leading in his church and in his colony, the members of the kingdom of heaven, the ways in which these people were growing up in the same soil as the Narragansetts. Because eventually, some of the ones who they initially thought were weeds turned out to be wheat. It's no secret that Christianity in America is in a difficult place. Church attendance demographically has been dropping since the 1950s. Religious affiliation hit its high point in the 50s, and it's been statistically in decline ever since. Over the last 2 years, there has been, again, a lot of falling off of folks going to church, or those who would call themselves Christians, either explicitly or nominally. If you think back to kind of how church looked a couple of years ago, it doesn't quite have the same feel now that it did then. Things are probably not going back. I don't have some kind of special access to the future. I don't have a crystal ball. But it's unlikely to me that socially Christians will have the place at the table that they once did. That's simply what it is, I think, and not one which Jesus is surprised about, that his followers in the kingdom of heaven would find themselves where they're not dictating the terms of the field, but that they are mixed in there as wheat among weeds. The weeds are numerous, and as we see here in the parable, the weeds are growing because God is a generous and patient God who lets the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike. The world keeps turning and sustaining both of those who believe in Christ and those who don't, those who come to church and those who don't, those whose lives are intertwined with ours at the roots. They are our neighbors. They are systems which Christians and non-Christians share in, like schools and workplaces, voting booths, language patterns. They're events of history that tie us together, things like droughts and freezes, national disasters, stock market declines. We are tied together, weed and wheat together, in innumerable ways. And it can be an amazing opportunity. We can look at that as being a disaster, as simply annoyances, or we can take a cue from Roger Williams to say, maybe this way in which we are mixed in together, weeds and wheat, is an amazing opportunity. Some of the ones who we think are weeds, maybe not so. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to benefit folks who may not ever benefit us back. The kingdom of heaven's call in difficult times remains the same: to take up the call of Jesus in the sermon, where he lays out what this kingdom of heaven looks like, and to remember, it will be difficult, but God is with us in it all the while, because it's God's kingdom. A life which we live in and through the power of God and the presence of Christ. It's not a life that we try to live on fumes or on the memories of what God did in the past, but remembering that God is the one who is growing us in the present. God is the one who is feeding the soil. God is the one who is making the kingdom of heaven possible at all. All of that would be way easier if Christians were in control of the fields. If Christians could dictate the terms under which weeds grew or under which enemies could sneak in and start messing up the thing. But I'm reminded of the chorus that we just sang just a moment ago, where we said, "You are for me, not against me." That these are the promises which Christians hang on to say, yes, you have called us to this amazing thing, and there will be difficulties. And let us look at these as opportunities. The kingdom of heaven grows up amidst the weeds of various kinds, and the children of God are called to be faithful, patient, growing in and out of season, and sometimes, by God's grace, that which we thought were weeds might just turn out to be wheat after all.